Boker Tov, Shavua Tov. Thank you for coming. Our shiur today, as the rest of the series, is dedicated to Ilui Nishmat Rafael Moshe Ben Eliyahu. And our hero for today, Rabbi David Sinzheim, is mostly a forgotten hero. Is an extremely interesting figure. As we'd finish the shiur, hopefully, I hope to speak a few minutes about the legacy and to what extent he is an important figure to us today. And here, as we will see, there are very differing accounts between different historians. So it's very, very interesting what his impact on our existence. But be it as it may, he obviously is fascinating because the time he lived in is a very troubled one. And also a very faithful one to the future of Yahadut, of Judaism. So before we speak about Rabbi David himself, we should take a few minutes to speak about the situation of French Jewry as the 18th century began. Now, basically, it should have been that there would be nothing to speak about. That is because the Jews in France were deported once and again and then again. Now you'd ask me, how can you deport someone a few times? That's because they would allow them to return for very high bribes, and then a few years later they would again regret and throw them away. And that was throughout all of the 13th and 14th century, at least 5 times. If I counted it yesterday. It seems to me that it was about 5 times. And then in 1395, Charles VI was the king of France, and he more or less had the final word on the matter, and the Jews were completely deported from what was back then the French kingdom. Then French is, I don't know how to say נידרענהיים in French, but that's what it was. And then during the 16th and the 7th century, Jews did begin to reappear in France, but not legally. These were 2 groups of Jews. The first one was a smaller group that in the beginning of the 18th century, they were about 2,000 or 3,000 Jews, and they were Spanish Jews from Spain. Most of them went from Spain to Portugal when there was the big expulsion of 1492. And there they were forced to convert, and they escaped the Inquisition during the 15th and the 16th, the 17th century, and came to many, many places. Also, a few of them came to France. Now, they were, for some of them for a century or more, they acted like Christians. So their clothing, their language was European. And when they came to France, they changed their clothes to the French clothes. They were speaking French. They were keeping halacha more or less. But the community, their Jewish community was not a very strong one. As individuals, they would keep halacha. They would convene at the shul to make a mincha or a shachrit. But the Jewish community as a community was not recognized as an independent body. These were the Sephardic Jews. They didn't call them Sephardic, they called them Portuguese. So, but the Sephardic Jews of France. The other group, which was much bigger, there were about 20,000 of them, lived in Alsace, at Lorraine, but mainly at Alsace. Now, Alsace-Lorraine were 2 territories that were not part of French when Charles VI was the king of France. They were independent. Now, during the 17th century, and mainly in the, I don't know how to say this word, in Westphalia peace? Westphalia peace, okay. So in 1648, there was a big peace treaty after the 30 Years' War between France and the Holy Roman Empire, what would later be called Germany. These 2 countries would fight one with each other about every 20, 30 years. I guess that now it's the longest time they didn't fight for 600 years. I correct? Yeah, I think so. So after the 30 Years' War, they signed the peace treaty. And in the peace treaty, the French were able to take control of Alsace-Lorraine. These territories would again change hands every century or so, but they took control of Alsace-Lorraine, which to this day belong to France, and with it they inherited, as I said, about 20,000 Jews, and they were Ashkenazic Jews. They were Jewish Jews, so they would their clothing would be Jewish clothes, and they would speak Yiddish, which would be hated by the French. A, because it's not French, and the French hate everything that is not French, and B, not only that it's not French, even worse, it is similar to German, right? So it's double time worse. And so they were really not happy with these Jews, and basically they were illegally stationed in France, because after these territories were annexed into France, then basically the law of France, which is no Jews are allowed to live here, was supposed also to cause the deportation of the Jews of Alsace-Lorraine. But these Jews made themselves very useful to the French army, because the Jews over there were somehow very good, as Jews will always have been, in arranging things. So let's say that you are a French general, and now you need 20,000 boots for your soldiers, which is very simple. How would you have 20,000 boots? Well, if you have the Jew court, right, that would the court Jew that would arrange for you, and he has many friends in different countries, so he can arrange. You have to remember, there are no factories. You cannot just produce 20,000 pairs of boots. But if you know many people all throughout Europe, and they rely on you and you rely on them, and you can make business with them, and you know their language, then you can come up with 20,000 pairs of boots much quicker than any other goy in the land. So they made themselves very valuable, very useful to the French army, and they remained in France, although their legal status was very dubious. But they remained in France. They were living under constant humiliation. We have to understand that. For example, just a simple example, in Strasbourg, they had a special tax for animals. If you bring your animal into the city, you have to pay a body tax. So the tax was for animals and for Jews. That was the type of life. No, it was hurting them in the pocket, but obviously the point here is not the pocket, it's the humiliation that everyone in the world, be his race as it is, be his color as it is, be his religion as it is, can come as a human being into Strasbourg. But if you are a Jew, then you have to pay this special tax like the animals. And also you are not allowed to sleep over in Strasbourg. You have, when night would come, you have to leave and be back to your small village. So that's how life were lived, and they had special laws regarding how and when you are allowed to marry as a Jew, because they wanted to control the population. They didn't want too much Jews being born. That's how life were lived. As you can understand, it was pretty miserable, but human beings can adapt to everything, and Jews not less. So people lived like that, and they got used to it, and it was what it was. Into this world, Yosef David Sinzheim is being born in 1736. Okay, so I guess that many of you know the years of the revolution, so you can immediately begin to make the calculation. He was born in 1736. Now, his father was a rabbi also. All of these are all small villages, right? No one was a rab of a big city, because, as I said, all of the big cities the Jews were not allowed to live in. So they all lived in small villages around the big cities. So in one of these small villages, Trיר and נידרענהיים, his father, Rabbi Zinitzheim, was the rab. Now, if you look at source Aleph, that is his own introduction. He has, Rabbi David Sinzheim has a biographical notes in the introduction of his Sefer, the Yad David. It's not a Sefer, it's a masterpiece. It's a volumes, it's a perush, we'll speak about it in Mitzvah Hashem, but it's a commentary volumes on the whole of Shas. So that's something that is very, very special. And in the introduction to the first volume that he printed when he was still alive, he had some, as I said, biographical notes. And so I would read it quickly. אמר יוסף דוד בן אדוני אבי מורי ורבי הרב החסיד מורנו הרב רבי יצחק זינצהיים זכרו לברכה לחיי העולם הבא, שהיה אב בדין בקהילת קודש טריר ובקהילת קודש נידרענהיים, מנוחתו כבוד. So I'm the son of Rabbi Yitzchak Zintzeיים, who was the rabbi in these communities. פתח דברי, ברכות והודאות למלך עולם ומלואו. So I want to begin my words with thanks and praises to the king of the whole world. Now, it's very interesting what he's going to say now. בחסדו ברא מן האנושי בצלמו. So in his mercy, in his grace, he created the human race in his, capital H, image. ובחר בישראל עמו. And it shows in the Jewish people as his nation. Now, that is very interesting. It's nothing out of our tradition, but it's interesting to open a book with a declaration that the whole of the human race was created in the image of God. But again, if you would remember the conditions he is living under, then you would understand why he finds it as something that is important to emphasize. Right? We remember the brotherhood of all human beings, or at least all men, as created in the image of God, is something that is strong in the air in French when he is writing this introduction. ונתן לנו תורתו תורת אמת, חיים, שעשועים, מעשה ידי אמן. He gave us this wonderful Torah of life. חיינו ואורך ימינו, that's our life, that's the length of our days. השפיע מחוכמתו ליראיו and gave his wisdom to people that fear him. והיא המחזקת ידינו בגלות המר והנימר הזה. And by the Torah is the only thing to which we cling in order to survive this disastrous exile. ולי עבדו איתה חסדו, and I was blessed by Hashem. שם חלקי מיושבי בית המדרש ולא מיושבי קרנות. I was born to become a member of the בית מדרש and not someone who is in the street. אחתי יונתי תמתי בחסיתי מנעוריי, so I was greeted, I was hugged by the Torah from the time I was a young boy. אשר נתגדלתי על ברכי אדוני אבי מורי ורבי הנזכר. אשר שימש כמה רבנים מובהקים ארזי הלבנון בעלי תריסין. Says, I was raised by my father. So as many other rabbis, he didn't go to yeshiva. The yeshiva, that's a cookie cutter, right? But if you are being born to a big rabbi yourself, then the big rabbi wants to educate you by himself. That would be homeschooling. So I remained by my father for homeschooling. And he says, my father הדריכני מנעוריי בלימוד הישר ומושכל, מיוסד על דרכי העיון האמיתי בש"ס, ואשר לא ניסה באלה דרך העיון הישר, לעולם לא יוכל להוציא הדין לאמיתו. He says, I was taught by my father not to do intellectual gymnastics, right? Not to what we call the bad pilpul. Right? I don't know how to even, what is the English word would be, right? The bad people, the evil people. We spoke about a few rabbis in the past that were fighting, raging against it. So he says, I was taught by my father, so I didn't went to the yeshivot where they ruined the mind of the young boys. I learned by my father, and he learned me just to learn straight forward, to understand things as they are, to learn from the Rishonim, and only because of that I am able now to give halacha. Because if you begin to go like that, then you may give a very nice shiur, but you are not able to read in a straight way and give a psak halacha in a clear and concise manner. So that's basically his approach. And he says, בדרך הזה הלך עם ממר אבי הרב זצ"ל. So that's how my father, the Rav, taught me, ותהילה לאל, and thank God, עשה והצליח. He was successful. ויוצא ציץ ויגמול שקדים על דרכי התורה, עד זמן חתונתי שהייתי כבן 20 שנה. So he's married pretty late for the age. He is married at the age of 20, but up to age 20 he sits by his father and he learns. כבר למדתי אצלו כל הש"ס חוץ מסדר קודשים. So that's 90% of Torah שבעל פה, he learned by his father. And then he has a whole detail of what did he learn with him, I skipped. אחר כך, so that's to the age of 20. Now, who is getting married to? So it's very important, meaning the wife herself is also very important, but the truth is, her family is even more important, because he is getting married to the brother of someone named Self-Bear. Now, it may well be that the name says nothing to you, but it was the sister of Self-Bear. So he was the brother-in-law of Self-Bear. Now again, Self-Bear means nothing, I guess, to the people sitting around here. But that was like the Rothschild of that time. And there was also a Rothschild back then. But he was someone that was extremely rich. He was a Jew from Alsace-Lorraine, and he was respected by the king, which was very rare for a Jew in France of the time. So he was respected by the king. He, for example, commissioned a letter from Moses Mendelssohn to the king of France, and he was able to get rid of the special animals tax that we spoke about earlier. So that was Self-Bear. He was a billionaire, again, in the time terms, and he's married to his sister. Now, a guy that is a son of a rabbi usually would not be very rich. So how he would come to marry such a prominent family? Because it was clear to everyone that he's going to be the next, what we would call today, Gadol Hador. So that's the real thing, right? The real deal. So for the real deal, you are willing to marry into a poor family. Why? Because you know that what you have here is worth the investment, if I may speak in such crude terms. So Issachar v'Zvulun, exactly. Okay, so that's the old world of money marries into Torah. And so from the age of 20, he can sit and learn Torah how much he wants, because his wife, Baruch Hashem, comes from a very well-to-do family. So that's what he says, אחר כך ברוב חסדי השם, ישבתי באוהלי התורה מתוך הרווחה. So I can sit in the tents of Torah, I don't have to make business. אין לי מחסור בעסקי העולם הזה. I have nothing that I need, no wanting in this world. ושמרתי מזוזות פתחי התורה מתוך הרחבת הלב. So I was able to learn Torah from a wide heart. והשם גמל לי מחסדו להיות מתמיד עליה כפי יכולתי. So I was able to sit down. He says, I did not just sit down and shower myself with money. I was learning Torah day and night. But I was able to do so. I was exempt from having to take care of basically making a living. ואמרתי אז לעשות, להתחיל הש"ס פעם שנית. So he finished the ש"ס first time, almost with his father, and he says now we begin to learn Shas second time. That's the age of 20. Next time עם הפוסקים בעיון רב, הדק היטב, לרד לעומקה של הלכה, I would learn it very very slowly, ואת אשר חנני אלוקים כתבתי לי למשמרת, וכמה דברים הרציתי לפני אדוני אבי עטר את ראשי זצ"ל ואמר ישר. So I was sitting and learning and writing to myself as I was going through the Shas, and I showed my notes to my father, who was still alive back then, and he was happy, and everyone was happy. But you understand that if that was all his life, then we would not be speaking about him today. So things are going to happen. Let's continue. When he reached the age of 30, כבר עלה בדעתי לחבר חיבור גדול על 4 טורים, so he began to write a book on the Shulchan Aruch, ובשנת תצליח, תצליח is 1778, נפתחו דלתי בית המדרש הגדול. So his brother-in-law הוקם על ידי גיסי, הגביר המנוח המרומם, נפתלי הרץ מדלסהיים, again, the name that he was known by is Self-Bear. So Self-Bear, he opened the yeshiva, meaning he financed now he is financing not only his brother-in-law, but the whole yeshiva that his brother-in-law can stand in its head, which is a beautiful thing to do. Yeah, if my brother-in-law here, that's so he opened the yeshiva, הוא הגבר אשר הקים עולה של תורה, שמו יצא בכל המדינות, גודר גדר, עומד בפרץ בת עמו, obviously is paying his tribute to his brother-in-law, and praises him, גדלו ורבו מעשיו במלאכת שמיים, אין בעבודת גופו, לפני מלכים התייצב, he speaks with kings, the king of France, ושם נפשו בכפו, והציל רצוצים למוות, פדה מנשחת, so he's able to help his poor brothers, Jewish brothers, ביטל את המעוררים ואת הצוערים, so he was able to cancel the special tax that we spoke about earlier, וסיר חרפן, was able to remove the shame from the people of God, and he gave much tzedakah. I skip a little, in the year תקנ"ד, 1794, and that's a very important date, his brother-in-law was niftar. That's after the revolution. But it's in the midst of the terror. So that's very important. So his brother was niftar, מנוחתו כבוד, and then problems began. אמרתי, הנה דודים לסדר חיבורי על הש"ס תחילה ולהציע לפני כל דבר קשה. He wanted, so he is, now let's go back, let's say to the revolution itself. So that would be 1789. So if he was born in 1736 to 1789, he is 52 as the revolution breaks out. And in the beginning, he's able to sit there near Strasbourg, in Alsace, that's in the periphery. Wow, what does he care about what is happening in Paris? So he's still able to sit and learn. But then, in Shnat Berachamim Rabim, Shnat Berachamim Rabim in Gematria is 1792. What happens in 1792? What happens to the king? A very famous head is now being cut off, and that is the head of the king, and the terror really begins. אז הלחץ והרעש והמלחמה גברו, והכריחו אותנו ללכת לעיר שטרסבורג, והיינו עוסקים ביחד. He's hiding in Strasbourg. Why? Because what was happening was, it was, I mean, you can read about the times, obviously, but it was real craziness, just craziness. Now, really, the French revolutionaries, we are speaking about the time, of course, of Ventan and Robespierre and Mort and all of these famous names. Now, they were not really after the Jews. The Jews were very small fish. They were not after the Jews. They were after the Catholics. The Catholic Church, which had vast territories in France and a lot of wealth and money and a lot of power and influence. They were after them very successfully, if I may say. And as part of the measures, they had special regulations against religion. Now, many of the local administrators were just happy to take these regulations and also apply them to the Jews. So, for example, one of the regulations was that, and it was really craziness, they said, we want, instead of having a weekday of 7 days, that's really irrational. Having a weekday of 7 days, 7 is not divided by anything, that doesn't make any sense. And the months, sometimes it's 28, sometimes 29, sometimes 30, the whole thing makes no sense. It would make much more sense to have a week off 10 days. 10 days, much more sensible. And that would also help us to completely uproot Sunday as the day of rest. Because from now on, the day of rest is the 10th day. So in our week of 10 days, the rest day is the 10th day. And if you do not work during the week, then you begin by being fired, but you can also be fired, right? I mean, the guillotine is already, now it was invented during the French Revolution as part of the mass production, right? So we have now mass productions, so we can now mass kill people with now for us in the 21st century, guillotine is very primitive. We can kill people much more effectively. But back then, that was regarded as something of a great innovation, the guillotine. So every court had a private guillotine, and if you are not working when you are supposed to work, then you are suspected as a Catholic. Now again, the laws were against the Catholics, but you can imagine, as I said, that the local administrators, they were only happy also to apply them to the hated Jews. and things were very, very, very in a very bad state. So he was running away, he was hiding in order just to keep the Shabbat. And also there were laws against extreme books. So extremist books would be put to the fire. What is, for example, the Bible? That's a very extremist book because it calls to do many, crazy things. So the revolutionaries would burn Bibles. Now again, when they make these laws, it was not against the Jews. It was against the church. But when you have a happy mob going around burning books, what you think would happen? So we have, for example, a tshuva. Look at source Gimel. That's they printed a few years ago. They printed responses by him. Machon Yerushalayim printed responses by him that they found in different places for manuscripts, and they put it into. He never did that, but they put it into a book, and they printed a few of his tshuvot. And one tshuva is about: are you allowed to erase the name of God from a Sefer Torah? Why would you do so? So would you do so when there is a mistake? Means, for example, the name was written without the proper kavana. So are you allowed to erase the name? So that's an interesting halachic question. Inside this tshuva, let's read it. Lekader Hashem beSefer Torah. So erase the name from a Sefer Torah. Hine beze ma'aracha mul ma'aracha. He says there are different poskim. Ubesifri li yoredeh הבאתי שו"ת העושים about the opinion that does that ban. ואף על פי שדעת הגאון מורינו אברהם ברודה, היה להתיר, so there was a very important rabbi, French rabbi, that allowed, והנה כן, אני מעולם לא התרתי. He says, I never thought that it is allowed to erase the name of Hashem from a Sefer Torah, even if there is a need. What do I think that it should be done? What you should do is cut the whole page and put it into Gniza. ונהגו, but he says, but if there is no other way, and you have to erase the name, he says, so do it. נהגו לקדור עמו תיבה לפניו או לאחריו שלא ייראה כקודר השם. So erase not only the name of Hashem, but also a word before or after, so it would not be as sharp that you're erasing only the name of God. וצריך להשימו בכלי חרס. There is a yud missing here. So then you need to put it into like a jar, and gniza. So the remnants of what you had erased should be put in gniza. ולקוברו בבית הקברות, and then put it in the cemetery. וכן עשינו מקרוב. He says that's what we had to done. בחתיכות ספרי תורה, when there were pieces of ספרי תורה, שבאו מימי הבהלות, that came from the time of the disasters, the frightenings of what we call today the terror. Behala is terror. So from the days of the terror, והיו בידי גויים. So these pieces, there were different pieces of Sifrei Torah going around, and the Gentiles had them. ולקחנום, we bought them, money. וקברנום בכלי חרס, we put them into jars בבית הקברות. So that's a small reminder of what is happening now. So this man is in the 6th decade of his life, and up till now everything was roses, and suddenly everything falls apart. Everything falls apart, and the Jewish state is now. It is very strange, because I'm speaking about the Jews being hit and the Sifrei Torah burned, and the Shabbat they are not allowed to keep. But at the same time, the revolutionary French government gave emancipation to these Jews. Now they began with giving emancipation to the Sephardic Jews because they look like human beings, so you can give them emancipation. But the Ashkenazic Jews, it took them another year to understand that they also, that's how it was, they also should be granted human rights. But to women, by the way, they didn't get human rights. So the Ashkenazic Jews were not necessarily in bad company. But it took another year for the Ashkenazic Jews in Alsace also to get human rights. And so what happened was that the individual Jew is now equal, but the Jewish community was devastated, which in a sense is the introduction to the Jews' state of being in the modern world. The individual Jew is in a much better shape than in the medieval times, but the Jewish community is shattered. All of its power is stripped away. That's very important to understand when we speak about, again, we all grew up and were born into this world. So for us, it is simple. It is simple for us that today I can daven in this shul. Tomorrow I can decide that I'm, I don't know, a Christian. I don't go to the church. And next day I will become a Muslim. And the day after I'm a Buddhist. No one can say anything. Not the government, and also not the Jewish community. I guess that as a rabbi I would be fired. But a part of that, and maybe I can sue in court. I don't know. But a part of that, no one can say anything. For thousands of years, that was not the situation. You cannot just become whatever you want. It may be that in a Christian world they would allow you to become from a Jew to a Christian, but they would never allow you to go back or to become a Muslim. And if you do not come to shul, let's say that you want to stay Jew, but you do not to come to shul, you know what? You just don't come to shul on time. We can lash you. And we did. Yeah. And we can, for example, decide that every Jewish male has to participate in at least one Torah shiur a week. And if you do not participate, then we can take money. We can, as I said, we can corporal punishment, everything. And taxes, how are they being paid? The individual Jew has no connection to the government. The individual Jew is represented by his Jewish community. The taxes, the king goes to the Jewish community and he asks for the tax, demand the tax money. And the community can divide the tax in whatever way it seems plausible. Sometimes to be more just, sometimes to be less just, but it was the self-rule, it was autonomy. All of this would now completely disappear. It's a whole different game. Up till now, you had captured audience. At least if the man wanted to remain Jew, he was a captive audience. But from now on, if you can keep him, he's yours. But if you cannot keep him, then he can become atheist, he can become Christian, he can do whatever he wants, and you can say nothing. And that's a part of the Torah's course being banned, and a part of the shuls being closed down, and a part of everything we spoke about up till now. That is the real tectonic change that, in a sense, we are dealing with to this day, to this very day. Now, as you know, things slowly settled down. And basically, they settled down. There was reaction, as happens every time, as maybe we are living through right now. When the pendulum, right, is going very much to the left or to the right, you can count on it, that there would be a reaction. And after the years of terror, there came a reaction. And it all settled down in the end. I mean, in the end of this story, it settled down with Napoleon claiming himself as the emperor, and first the consul, and then the emperor of France. That is in the beginning, the very beginning of the 19th century. So 1801, if I remember correctly, he is making himself into a Caesar, a Caesar of France. Okay, fine. And things more or less settled down. But Napoleon we all know him as a great general, and obviously he was. But he was also a great civil designer. The Code of Napoleon, the Napoleonic Code of Laws, is being used, I think, in France up to this time. So writing a code of law that would survive for 200 years with very, very great shifts, that alone can show you that we are speaking about someone with a big mind, with a great mind. Now, again, what do I think about his moralities may be another discussion, but he is a genius. Okay. Now, he is faced with the problem about the Jews. Because we are now 10 years or so after the French Revolution. Jews were granted emancipation. but are they really French? The Gentiles from Alsace-Lorraine come to Napoleon and they have grievances. They say, you gave emancipation to the Jews. Now they are taking from us usury, right? Rebate, right? Now they do not take it from themselves. Now, if they were real French and they would think that you are not supposed to take usury from your brother, then why do they take it from us? So they do not see themselves as French. They are a different nation. And we are now, French is a nation state. They are the first, if you want, of the modern nation states. And there is no room for another nation in our midst. So either they are French and they behave to everyone the same, or they are out. And this problem is, of course, the problem of the Jew in the modern world. Because if in the medieval times, the problem of the Jew was his religion, in the modern time, at least on the surface, the problem is not your religion, it's your nationality. Are you really a faithful French, Englishman, American, or are you more faithful to your brothers, to your Jewish brothers, than to your host country? That's not a question that is easy to answer, because the answer may be an answer that our Gentile friends are not interested to hear. And sometimes it's an answer that we ourselves are not candid enough to answer to ourselves. So these Gentiles, they're anti-Semitic. Don't be mistaken for a minute. They want their money back. They don't want to pay what they owe to the Jews. But they come up with a very important argument that is not so easy to be defended from. And Napoleon is Napoleon. He doesn't want to just leave it as a sore wound, as an open wound. He says, I want to get to the bottom of the matter. So he calls for a convention of the Jewish notables. And he says all Jewish important people and rabbis should convene to France. Now, he had in his mind maybe to do something that even from other countries in Europe. But as you can imagine, Jews from other countries were not interested in participating in something that Napoleon arranges, because that would be seen in their countries like a betrayal. So basically, he had only, with two exceptions, he had only Jews from France and from Italy, because back then, Italy is under French occupation. So he has Jews from France and from Italy coming to Paris to discuss the question of the Jewish problem. Are they French or are not they French? And Napoleon gives them 12 questions that would dim their status. Now, it was very clear. If you are not eligible, if you do not want to be citizens, Napoleon says, I'm transparent. If you want to be French and you are willing to accept upon yourself the Frenchness, be my guest. And then you'll be completely in equal rights. If you are not able to be French, it's your choice, then there is no room for you in France. So there is a big carrot. There's also a very big stick. One thing is clear. What was going on up till now cannot stay. There would not be any more a state within a state. The Jewish community as an entity would not be tolerated anymore. Now, Napoleon was not really transparent, as you can imagine. He wanted a certain answer. He wanted the Jews to say that they are French. So when he convened these different Jewish leaders, he tried to make sure that he has a majority not of old school rabbis, but of the Nissen, the beginning of the reform movement, and laymen and rich people, because the rich families have a lot to lose. So obviously they would be willing to sell, not all of them, but many of them, would be willing to sell almost everything in order to save their citizenship. Now, what were the 12 questions? You can see it in source Hey. Now, the quotation here is from a letter, a response by Rabbi Ishmael Mimudina. Rabbi Ishmael Mimudina was an Italian rabbi who was also summoned to this gathering, but as he was already above 80, he was not able, or at least he didn't, I don't know, he didn't come. He said it because of his age. You can, meaning it's an open guess. Was he really too old, or did he say, I lived enough, I'm not? That's a problem for the young generation. So he didn't want to come to the gathering, but he did send them his own answers. So from the answer he wrote, we have the questions in an Hebrew form. ראשון לציון שאל האיש, so Napoleon asked, אדוני הארץ, אם מותר לישראל לישא הרבה נשים. This is a question. Napoleon read the Bible. In the Bible it says that people are marrying a lot of wives. So are you Jews? So you see the ignorance. So he says, are you Jews still marrying many women? Now you remember that it's for 700 years now that Ashkenazic Jews do not marry many women. But fine. So that was the first question. Second question, אם על פי דין תורה יש רשות ביד כל אדם לגרש את אשתו. So now you have to remember, he is a Catholic. The Catholic, they do not have divorce. That's a foreign concept. So the question is, are you really allowed to do that? And if you are, do you require that the civil law would also authorize that? That's a very important question, as we'll see. So that's the whole question of religious marriage and divorce versus civil marriage and divorce. How do you handle this duality? So you can see that's really laying the foundations to the existence of the modern Jew. Now, in the medieval times, there was not a question. The king did not care if you are married. That was up to the Jewish community. The Jewish community had their own registration. The king can put sometimes limitations, but how do you get married? It doesn't care how do you get married. But now in modern day France, and that is really modern day France, then you have to be registered by the state as being married. So how do you handle that? Next. אם הישראלית תוכל להתחתן עם הנוצרי והנוצרית עם ישראלי. So Napoleon is not, beating around the bush, right? Now, what about what we call today interfaith marriage? What do you say about that? Now, you understand that he is putting them really between the rock and the hard place. Because if they would say, no, we are not willing to have Jews marry with Christians, then obviously you are not French. But if can a rabbi say that, yes, we are willing to accept marriages between a Jew and a Christian? Even the reforms back then, I don't think that they were willing to do that. I'm not sure. But obviously the Orthodox rabbis are not even close. But what can you answer to such a question? Next. לפי דת האומה הישראלית, חשובים בעיניהם הצרפתים כאחים או נוכרים? Let's cut all of this Gentile business. Who are your real brothers? Your hated Englishmen, right? But from the same religion? Or the German guys, the Yekes? Or we, the French Christians, or not, or atheists, or whatever we are? Who are your real brothers? Are you with me? We are, Baruch Hashem, we live now here. Everyone sitting here is in Eretz Israel. But if I'm speaking now in English, I guess that I'm speaking to people that were not born in Eretz Israel. Are you willing to answer over a newspaper, even this day, 2023, to write over the pages of newspaper, if you're in America, that you feel more connection to the Jews, let's say in Israel, than to other citizens, even in the United States? That's the most liberal country. That is not something that is going to go so swiftly, even nowadays. And you can only imagine back then. I continue. Next question. בין אחי ובין אחי, מהם ההנהגות שהדת העברית מצווה להתנהג עם הצרפתים שאינם מאומתם ומידתם? He says, the earlier question was a philosophical one. Do you see them as brothers? Oh, or do I care? I cannot. Yes, I see them as my brother. I love them to the bottom of my soul. Okay. Now, legally, do you consider them as your brothers? Obviously, the next question will be about ribbit, as you can imagine. Next question. אם היהודים שדרים במדינת צרפת והמלכות נוהגים עמהם כשאר בני מדינתו, אם הם חושבים מדינת פרנסיה כמו עיר לידתם, ואם חייבים לעמוד על הפרץ להגן על המדינה, what about army service? Why should you Jews be exempt from army service? If you are equal rights citizens, you should also have equal duties. That is just to be expected. וכן אם חייבים לקיים דתי המדינה, I guess there's a French word, הקווידיסי, מדיני שלהם. So are you obligated just to the French rules? Or do you see yourself only as committed to the Jewish laws? מי הוא המכתיר בקטע הרבנות חכמיהם ומוריהם? Who is the one to decide who is the rabbi? Now you can understand why it's important for Napoleon such a question, because he is thinking ahead. Napoleon was already able, by the time that in 1806, already in 1802, he signed a concord, an agreement with the Pope, in which the Pope basically gives him the Church of French to rule over. That's basically the meaning of the concord. So he was able to already take control of the Christian church in French. He also made the Protestants into a church. They were not a church, but before that, each Protestant community was to itself. He said, no, I'm not willing to have free radicals going around. I want everything to be very hierarchical. That's very French. Right? The government is very big, it's very strong. So everything is from top down. I want he said to the Protestants, I want you to have a pope as well. And they had, to this day. Now he obviously that's what he wants to do with the Jews as well. He wants to have the Jews under his thumb. In order to do so, he needs to control the process in which rabbis are becoming rabbis. So this is the next question. How do you decide who is your rabbi? By the way, what is the answer? How do you decide that someone becomes a rabbi? That's a very vague question in Jewish, right? In Judaism. Who made the Chazon Ish into the Chazon Ish? He was not even a Rav of a shul, to the best of my knowledge. No one chosen him. It is, popular vote, you may say. Who made the Noda B'Yehuda into Noda B'Yehuda? He was the Rabbi of Prague, he was chosen by the people of Prague, but obviously his authority did not come from him being the Rabbi of Prague. His authority came from him being the Noda B'Yehuda. So that's a tricky question to answer. Next. איזה משפט מדיני נוהגים הרבנות שלהם בקהל הדתם? What are exactly the type of authority that the rabbis have in their communities? What are they able to do? Excommunicate, throw from the community, ban people from coming into shul, maybe fine people, maybe even lash people. Next. מינוי הרבנים והנהגות מדיניות שלהם הוא מכוח ציווי הדת או מנהג בעלמא. Now I'm sure that some Jew gave him this question because that's a rabbinical question. Be it the way you appoint rabbi as it may, is it your religion that commanded that, or is it just the way you handle? Now obviously if it's only the way you handle, you would be more open to changes. 10. אם דת יהודית אוסרת לבני ישראל שום אומנות, is there anything that the Jews are not allowed to deal with? What he is worried about, he's asking himself, why there are no Jewish farmers? Why they are all doctors and lawyers? He says, maybe by the religion they are obligated to be lawyers and lenders. So that's the next question. Then, אם הדת היהודית אוסרת לישראלים לקחת ריבית זה מזה, and the 12 is אם אסור לפי דת דיני ישראל לקח ריבית משלו מבני עמנו, so that's questions about usury, and that is the question, are they allowed to take ריבית from one another and from others? Now, it would be fascinating to have, it would be more than one shiur, to go through the answers that these Jews gave him, because you can imagine Even if they were all Orthodox rabbi, it would be very difficult to answer that. But you have to remember, it were not only Orthodox rabbi there. The Orthodox rabbis were in minority. They had to come up with something that would be agreed upon everyone and would serve the interests of everyone and also would not cause them all to be thrown away. And Napoleon, I guess, in order to make everything more clear, made the first meeting on Shabbat. So the rabbis wanted it to be postponed. But the other Balei Batim said, no, you are crazy. If we would begin by asking him to postpone because of Shabbat, we would be immediately rejected. So that's a pikuach nefesh. And we must convene on Shabbat and write the votes and everything. And the rabbis had no choice. So they wrote their ballots, their notes from before, from Friday, and just put them in the box on Shabbat. But some of the Jews there were writing on Shabbat in front of the rabbis. So things are collapsing. Now, again, for us, meaning I'm a rabbi, I'm walking here, and people have no problem driving. No, not from the shul, but from Talmud, people that know me. They know that I'm a rabbi. They have no problem driving here and saying Shabbat Shalom to me while they're driving. That's just the way it is, and it's sorrowful, but I'm not shocked when this happens. But back then, for a rabbi coming from a small community, meeting with Jews that not only that they disgrace the Shabbat, but doing it in front of the rabbi, that's shocking. That's shocking. So we don't have the time to go through the answers, which is, again, that's a fascinating document. Just one thing, very short. What about marrying with non-Jews? So they cannot ban it. You have to understand. If they would ban it, that's the end of Jewish presence in France. That's very clear. But they cannot agree because that's the end of Judaism. So what do we do? Now, the answer is, it's in Sosvav here, but I would say it in my words. They say, we have this concept of dina de malchuta dina, that we follow the law of the land. Now, I'm saying to you, following the law of the land has nothing to do with the laws of marriage. It has to do only with monetary issues. However, they were very clever. It's Rabbi David Sinzheim sitting there and formulating these answers. And he says, you know what? For the king, or for the emperor here, for the government, why it is important someone is married or not? For monetary issues, right? How to tax them, give them certain exemptions, etc., etc., etc. So for monetary issues, we, he says, as a religion, we do not uphold for such a marriage. But if they do, we understand that the government would give them a legal status of marriage, and we accept that because the law of the land is the law. And they add, we would not excommunicate them. So now you understand, that's not something that the rabbis would have wanted to say, but under the circumstances, that's the best you can do. And to this day, more or less, that's the best you can do. What do they do in America nowadays? If someone from a family is chas v'chalila intermarry, that's basically what they do. Meaning they do not uphold from the marriage from the religious side, but they understand. They also sometimes they would excommunicate, but most of the time they would not even do that. They understand that from a civil point of view, the marriage are upholding. So their formulation back then is more or less the formulation that we use till this very day. Not a happy one, but that's the coexistence of the Jew with the modern state. Now, Napoleon was happy with the answers. However, he was troubled that maybe this convention does not really reflect the Jewish opinions, but it only reflects the attempt to pacify him. So he said, what would be the best way for me to make these answers into binding ones? So someone told him that the highest authority for the Jews back in the day was the Sanhedrin. And that fitted Napoleon like a glove to the hand, because he liked this type of dramatic, being an emperor. And that was just fit for him. So he said, that's best. I'm going to revive the Sanhedrin. And again, he invites Jews from all over the world. Obviously, only Jews from France and Italy come. And the head of the Sanhedrin is our hero, Rabbi David Sinzheim. Not because Napoleon thought he's such a great guy. He's an Orthodox, he's backward. But he knows that if he signs things, everyone would accept. So Rabbi David Sinzheim, basically, I am sure that if he would have given the ability, he would stay in Strasbourg and just write his books. But life had rolled him now to become the head of the Parisian Sanhedrin, the head of Napoleonic Sanhedrin, which was a very strange event. If you saw the picture I sent to the shiur, that's the hat, right, with these two heels they gave him, and he was sitting there, and the whole thing was, I don't know, I guess it was seemed respectful for the people sitting there, but it's like a joke for us. They were sitting there with half a circle, and everyone has these special clothes, each one according to his rank, and the whole formalities. And they signed these answers that they gave to Napoleon last year. They signed it as binding halachot to the whole of the Jewish people. And that was called the Persian Sanhedrin. And fascinating event. Now, what was the real halachic authority of the Sanhedrin? Obviously nothing. I apologize, but obviously nothing. Most of the people, the attendees, were not even rabbis. And some of them were really ignorant that couldn't even read Hebrew. But that was what it was. So they convened there, and Rabbi David Sinzheim had no other choice. So he crafted the answers very carefully, not to destroy halacha, but on the other hand, to somehow pass by. And again, we could have gone through what he wrote, but we don't have the time. But it would be very familiar to us, because we are following that in Chutz La'aretz, not because he wrote that as part of the Sanhedrin, but because that's the best route, that's the best path that the Jewish nation were able to come with to live in coexistence with the modern state. Now, that's a very sad coexistence. We have to remember, we have lost. I'm not speaking about the Shoah right now. Let's leave the Shoah aside, if that can be said. But let's put the Holocaust aside for a few minutes. Imagine there was no Holocaust. We would still suffer a loss of about 70% of our view. That's something that we have to understand. And it's very difficult for us to maintain cohesiveness in the modern times. We are able now, we have some good answers, basically the yeshivot, but they work only for a little segment of the population. And the part of Israel, which is the real answer that we have to the challenges of the modern world, and that it has its own problems and challenges, but a part of Israel, we don't really have a good answer. Look what happens in the United States. You can be a Jew as long as you want, but they don't want. I mean, 80%. That's the sad truth. And that happened in France as well, and it happened in all over Western Europe. And I don't see how it can be possibly be maintained that it won't have happened in Eastern Europe as well, given the same conditions. The conditions in Eastern Europe became very different, but given the same conditions. After the Sanhedrin had ratified these laws into binding laws for the whole of the Jewish people, Napoleon was very happy and released them to their way, and the Sanhedrin returned to its to its grave. But he put Rabbi David Sinzheim as the chief rabbi of all of France. As I said, Napoleon was a little dictator, not a little, a big dictator. And he wanted everything to be run by little dictators. So he had the little dictator for the Catholic Church, he had a little dictator for the Protestants, and now he has a little dictator for the Jewish religion. And this was his man, Rabbi Yosef David Sinzheim, who would now have to live in Paris, away from his books. He had a very nice library in Strasbourg, and he had to abandon that. He lived in Paris. He wrote a book, a few volumes, named Minchat Ani, meaning the sacrifice of the poor. He says, I'm poor because I don't have my books. I'm sitting now in Paris, I have nothing. By the way, having no books, he was able to produce more than I am able to produce with books and with electronic devices. So we're thinking about a real genius here. And he was dealing with different type of questions about marriage, about everything, about shaving Chol HaMoed, everything that you can want. And you read his answers and you see that he is trying to defend traditionalism, but it's a lost battle. That's the truth. It's a lost battle because he has not only the situation is difficult, he has no soldiers. The Jews are not interested in what he has to sell. People are complaining to the French government that the rabbi is speaking too much about mikveh and about mitzvot ben adam, about arbat aminim, and he's not speaking enough about Yiddishkeit, that is having good relations with the goyim. I'm serious. We have the letters of people complaining about this rabbi who is too Jewish of a rabbi. So he operated a very difficult situation. After a few years, he dies in 1812, and he's not even buried in a Jewish cemetery. He's being buried in the Père Lachaise. I hope that I pronounce it right. I worked for it in a few days. And that is the revolutionary cemetery of Paris. It was opened during the revolution, and the officials of the government are being buried there, and he's an official, so he is being buried there. Now it's in a Jewish plot. There is like a Jewish plot with the Rothschilds, with this type of people, but that's not where such a great rabbi was supposed to be buried, and he's buried there to this day. His matzeva is there. He was like a prisoner in a golden cage, but a prisoner. That's very sad. One of his, now he had no boys, he has only one daughter. His wife that we spoke about, the sister of Self-Bear, she died in a young age of 51, and he didn't remarry, and he had only one daughter from her. He had no boys, so he called his magnus opus, his commentary on the Shas, he called it the Yad David. Yad means the memory, right, the zecher of David, after himself, because he has no boys. Now, almost the whole thing remained in manuscripts and got lost during the Holocaust. However, one of his descendants from this daughter, it's from the Auerbach family, decided that he is taking responsibility for the printing of the manuscripts of his grandfather. And Machon Yerushalayim printed 10 books about the Shas and about 3 books about different issues in Yanim, and this volume, which is a commentary on the Torah, beautiful books, printed beautifully, and a lot of the information I gave you today is taken from the introduction that he wrote, this descendant wrote in the introduction to this book. What about his legacy? Now, as I said, I don't think that anyone sees the decisions of the Sanhedrin in France as binding. But nonetheless, he charted the first maps to this uncharted part of the Jewish world that is the modern existence of modern state, in which, again, the community loses its power and is only responsible for religious matters. And how you keep Jews, or try to keep Jews in such an atmosphere. And how do you keep with your Gentile neighbors? And on one hand, being a type of a loyal citizen, and the other hand, not losing your identity as a Jew, and not slip into being a Frenchman with a Jewish religion, right? Because that's not what we want. We want our Jews to be Eden Jews, right? Jewish Jews. So how do you maintain that? He tried to craft, we may say, the first response to this crisis. To this day, I'm not sure that our answers are much better than what he was able to give back then. And his burial in the French cemetery is a sad testament, I think, to our challenges, our successes, but also the challenges that are still looming ahead with the modern world and the Jews in the diaspora living under these circumstances. So again, a fascinating figure, and I hope that we didn't only learn about him and from his Torah, but also about the special circumstances and life that he had. Thank you.
Thank you.
Not that I know about. He does write that he wants to make Aliyah and live in the Holy Land, but everyone wants to make Aliyah and live in the Holy Land. So I don't think so. For him, I think that showing Tzionut would be extremely dangerous. In the French atmosphere back then, saying that I want to go from French to another country, that's a suicide. That's not something that you say or write. Hardly think. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great.